the thing. Okay, let me just make sure I have the chat open so I can see everybody. This is where having 2 monitors is really wonderful. Okay, here we go. Week 2, business and tax entities. And okay. Oh, please tell me this updated. Yes, it did. Okay. Great. First, disclaimer, I'm not an attorney. This is not legal advice, which I am not qualified or licensed to give. This is a general primer on basic issues, which offers no personalized advice. Please contact a licensed attorney for specific advice. That's something I have to say, right? You know, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not giving you what can be considered legal advice. When we talk about taxes, I'll give you a similar disclaimer that I'm not a CPA. Okay, business entity. It's an organization or some sort of theoretical thing created by one or more individuals for the purpose of conducting business. There are a bunch of different kinds of business structures, business entities, which each have different legal and tax implications, and they impact how the entity operates and functions. Some of these structures are just legal structures. Some of them are just tax structures. We'll talk about a number of legal structures that are not available in other states that are in Rhode Island. So it's basically a giant mess of a giant tangle of things that you can be in order to, you know, get income. And this includes a nonprofit, right? It's the purpose of a nonprofit is still to conduct business, just a different kind of business. So we'll talk about that a little bit today too. Okay, I recommend deciding what business structure you want to be, you know, before you get to all of the other things, because it will guide your legal and tax liabilities. And it really starts, there's a lot of, as I just mentioned, state-specific stuff. So it really, I'm going to talk about Rhode Island stuff. So if your address is in Massachusetts, this will be helpful, but a little bit, some stuff will be a little bit different. Okay. That being said, if you've been doing stuff for a while, making an income, like it's not a bad thing. You can always move forward in business structures and get more complex. It's harder to move backwards. It's harder to unincorporate, right? Okay, if you're taking other business startup courses, like SCORE has some online business startup courses, which are not, they're very dry. I'll say that. They're all like webinars with an electronic voice. Choosing your business and legal and tax entity or structure is usually like step 6. But it's my opinion that for artists and arts businesses, which y'all are, you've already done a lot of the previous steps, or they don't apply to you. There are things like, are you ready to start a business? What are you going to sell? Who are you going to go into business with, right? It's all things that you already know, because you already know that you want to make or are already making an income from your art practice, whatever that is. You already know what your art practice is. And your business plan, we already talked about last week, just sneakily, and we didn't call it a business plan, we called it values and goal setting, right? Which in my opinion, makes more sense for artists than a very formal business plan, because y'all are not selling a thing separate from who you are as a person and the work you're making, right? They're intertwined. So we're jumping forward in the classical business startup process. Okay, sole proprietorship essentially is just you doing your thing. This is not a separate entity in any way from you as a human. So that means you bear all legal and tax liability for everything that happens within your business, your sole proprietorship. The things that are great about sole proprietorships are that you have total control. It's small, it's just you, it's super flexible. You can change it easily, or you can dissolve it, because all you have to do is stop making an income, right? Unlimited liability. So if you like sell somebody a thing and it hurts them, and they sue you, your assets are at risk. It's also difficult but not impossible to get outside investments and loans. If you're looking for business startup loans, that's a whole other thing that I can talk to you about looking at SBA and LISC, which are more likely to take some chances on guaranteed loans for more risky businesses, which ARC's businesses count as. And you can be doing your business just under your name or a trade name or a DBA, which is a doing business as, which we'll talk about next week. Okay, an example of a sole proprietorship is me. When I was a full-time working artist, I was a lighting designer, stage manager, production manager. I had a bunch of income from a bunch of different places. Service-based, I wasn't selling anything. I didn't need anything for sales tax or business permits. And I didn't officially incorporate, right? I just made money as a freelance artist and it went right on my tax return as a Schedule C. Okay, what you need to do to start being a sole proprietor: make money with your art, report this income and expenses on your Schedule C. That's it. You're a small business, right? So if you're filing a Schedule C for your art practice for any income, you are already a small business that is a sole proprietor. Some complex tax issues that I will touch on in a later session when we talk about taxes is the IRS's definition of a hobby versus a business, particularly when you're reporting a loss. You can take a loss on a business, you cannot take a loss on a hobby. So that's really about documentation. And like, from what I know of y'all's art practices, you'll be fine, because it's things like, do you have a website? Are you like selling in a formal way? You know, those things that show that you're seriously undertaking this as a form of income as a business, rather than just something, rather than me like knitting a shawl for my friend's wedding, right? Which is a hobby. And I can't take a loss from that on my taxes. Okay, questions about sole proprietorships. That's the easiest and simplest one, and y'all might all already be that. Great. Okay, a partnership is essentially a sole proprietorship, but with more people, guided by an agreement. So in the same way as a sole proprietorship, it's just like you have some words on a paper, but everything else passes through to each of the partners, usually an equal portion, but that can be changed based on the type of partnership or the type of agreement. But it all passes through to you: liability, income, loss, everything passes through to a Schedule C in the same way as a sole proprietorship. It's essentially a sole proprietorship with a bunch of people. I'll talk about this in like 2 more slides, a little bit more detailed, but if you want to start a partnership with someone besides your spouse, which is called something else, that's called a joint venture, but even if you're starting one with your spouse, create a written partnership agreement and have a lawyer look at it. So example, a small consulting firm that consists of 3 members focused on services. All of these members work from home and do some work on site, but they don't, you know, pay rent or anything together. They have a written partnership agreement that both income and expenses are passed through in equal proportion. They did register as a business, and they reserved their business and entity name with the Secretary of State, which we'll talk about again next week. Okay, what you need to start a partnership: literally just a partnership agreement. Like all contracts, this doesn't have to be written down. It can be oral, right? You can have an oral partnership agreement. Things to note about this. So it's sort of the same thing as a sole proprietorship. You just say you're doing it and you're doing it. It's a pass-through entity again, so all income and expenses go on a Schedule C. Another partner in your partnership can create a legal obligation for the partnership. So say your partner goes off the rails and does something you really disagree with and signs a contract, as the partnership, the whole partnership, including you, are bound to that. So this is one of the reasons why you want to get a partnership agreement written down. You're still personally liable for everything, both financially and legally, except for it's split evenly among the partners. Okay, so here's the definitely get a written agreement, make a contract for how you will work together, how you'll share profit, losses, and expenses, what happens during dissolution. So if you ever decide to dissolve the partnership, who can make what decisions and what level of oversight everybody has, that sort of thing, and get a lawyer to look at that. It will be worth it in the long run. You know, it won't be 10 hours of lawyer time. It'll be short. Partnerships do file a return with the IRS every year, but it's just an informational return. It's just reporting profits and losses and expenses. All the tax liability passes through to owners. So they're just saying, here's the money stuff. Okay, questions about partnerships? We're trucking right along. Okay, limited liability company. So I get a lot of questions about whether artists should be sole proprietors or LLCs. Here's the thing, they're different things, right? An LLC is a legal entity. At a state level, the sole proprietorship is the tax structure. So you can be both a sole proprietorship and an LLC. You are not automatically an LLC in the same way you are a sole proprietor. If you're filing a Schedule C, there's other things that you need to file with this at the state level. So it's just a legal structure that offers some liability protection and a little bit of separation from the business entity that's you and you, the human person. So it protects your stuff. It's very flexible. It's pretty easy to set up. I think it's a $150 filing fee with a Secretary of State to form an LLC. You still retain full control the same way you would a sole proprietorship or a partnership. And then taxes pass through to your personal return the same way they would if you were a sole proprietorship or a partnership. Both of those kinds of tax structures can be LLCs, right? So if you're ready, if you're at that point, particularly if you're selling stuff, I would recommend filing your LLC in the state of Rhode Island if your address is in the state of Rhode Island. You will not file taxes for the LLC, right? You'll just file them on your Schedule C. It's not an extra thing. Right. The example is a sound engineer with their own equipment who also has assets that could potentially be seized if they get sued, right? So they want to protect their personal assets from any business losses, but they still have all of those other things that a sole proprietorship or even a partnership has, like a bunch of different income streams, wants their flexibility, wants to retain control, not have any major legal and tax filing requirements, right? They don't want to jump over the hoops to start a nonprofit or a corporation. Okay, so this one is specific to Rhode Island. I think there's 9 other states that have what's called an L3C, not to be confused with a B Corp, right? 2 different things along the same line. And we'll talk about both of them because Rhode Island has both as legal structures. So it's essentially the same as an LLC, but businesses in the US, and I'm sure we'll talk about this when we get to IP, intellectual property law, a lot of, pretty much everything in the United States around business entities is set up around money, right? We're all about the capital. So most businesses, primarily corporations, their legal obligation is to make the most profit. So things like an L3C protect you a little from that, particularly if there's a lot of owners or if there's a lot of other folks involved at a decision-making level. So an L3C has a specific charitable or educational purpose similar to a nonprofit, but you are not a nonprofit. You're still essentially an LLC, but with a double bottom line, right? Where you have a social mission as a goal, as well as profit. There's not really very much benefit to filing as an L3C. It's basically the same as an LLC. And when you're, a partnership or a sole proprietor that has an LLC, you don't need to focus solely on profit in the same way a corporation does, right? You have less legal restrictions because it's just you making the decisions and you don't have shareholders. But it's an entity that exists in Rhode Island. Probably not necessary for like folks doing their own, artists doing their own thing, but might be, it's essentially a marketing thing. My example is a small art gallery owned and operated by 2 people, so it would be a partnership, has a specific mission to support LGBTQ artists and introduce the local community to their work. They explicitly say by forming an L3C that they are not only focused on making money, they're focused on this specific mission. However, they still get all the other benefits of an LLC and they retain the control, and the profits and losses pass through to the owners like a regular LLC partnership, sole proprietorship. Questions about that yet? Partnership. Yes, go back to a question from earlier. Yes, a partnership is basically a sole proprietorship with multiple people.
For the L3C example, are they a partnership and an L3C, or are they only an L3C?
So the L3C is the legal structure within the state of Rhode Island. You can be both in the same way you can be a partnership and an LLC. You could also be a sole proprietor and an L3C, right? So the partnership, the sole proprietorship is kind of a tax structure. The LLC, L3C is a state level, and those are both on the federal level. LLC, L3C are on a state level and they're legal structures.
Okay, so is as a sole proprietor a legal structure or no?
Yes and no, not in the same way as an LLC. Like you saying you're a sole proprietor means you don't have to do any filing paperwork like you do for an LLC. So it's not giving you any legal protection. It's essentially just you doing your thing. It's more of a tax structure, but you can be both, right? A sole proprietor and an LLC. If you're an LLC, you still have to have some sort of tax identity. So an LLC will have to be a sole proprietor, a partnership, something else to be taxed. Yeah, it's super complicated. They do not make it easy, and it's different. Like the LLC, like the state level structures are different in every state. Like I said, the L3C only exists in like 9 states. Yeah, tax code. It's fun. Okay, other questions? All right. Cooperative, right? Super sexy to artists and many other folks with politics similar to artists. It's a business or entity owned by and operated for the benefit of those using its services. That could be a worker-owned co-op or a user-owned co-op, right? And a place that we all are super familiar with co-ops is in like food, little grocery stores. And there you see both worker-owned, like my favorite when I lived in San Francisco, my favorite grocery store was Rainbow, and it's a worker-owned co-op, right? But there's also user-owned co-ops where you essentially buy a share and you get decision-making. Okay, so this one is a super messy structure because broadly, nationally, it's a business structure created kind of by a contract rather than a legal and tax entity. So it's a co-op can be a partnership It can be an LLC. It can be both a partnership and an LLC. It can be a C Corp. It can be an S Corp. It might be able to be a member. No, it couldn't be a member nonprofit. But so that's super confusing in other states. Here in Rhode Island, there is a legal entity. You can file you can, when you file your articles of incorporation, when you incorporate as a business, you can file as a workers cooperative that operates you as either a C Corp or an S Corp, and we'll get into what those are specifically in a little bit. A co-op is usually a corporation, and the shareholders are, you know, the users or the workers, the employees. So it's either user owned or worker owned, right? So it's about who owns the shares of the corporation. However, here we can also, in Rhode Island, we can also say specifically, this is a workers co-op where the workers own the shares, and the only people that can hold shares are the workers, right? But that's specific to Rhode Island. In most other states, a co-op is not its own legal structure within the state filings. You would file as a C Corp or an S Corp, and then make some sort of contract of who can be shareholders. It's a mess. It's all complicated. This is why I say, like, get a lawyer if you're going to get into the weeds. Like, I can talk you through LLC and an L3C, but like once you get into this stuff, we'll need a lawyer and an accountant. Okay. That's a great transition into corporation. So a corporation is a legal entity that's totally separate than its owners. It's taxed separately, and the corporation, the business entity itself, is held legally liable rather than the people, rather than the owner, like in an LLC. Entity is much more complex. It's much more difficult to change. It's much more difficult to dissolve, and it's more expensive to create and operate. There's a $400 tax requirement. You know, you're going to pay a little bit more. Well, the business is going to pay a little bit more in taxes, but also more to incorporate. And you'll have expanded record keeping and reporting. So your yearly tax return will be bigger than, you know, filing a Schedule C, because you'll file a separate tax return for the corporation. It will be more expensive to get prepared. Okay, so there's two kinds of corporation, a C Corp and an S Corp. C Corp, the C literally stands for conventional. If you're incorporating as a corporation, C Corp will be what it defaults to. This is no limit on shareholders. The business pays taxes on the income, right? The big stuff that you're thinking about when you think corporation are C Corps. S Corp limits the number of shareholders. So shareholders are the owners. Limits the number of shareholders to 100. Taxes pass through to the shareholders. So profit and losses pass through in the same way as sort of a LLC. And all of the shareholders must be US citizens. An S Corp gets significantly more scrutiny by the IRS than a C Corp does. And it has a little bit more complex regulations. That being said, there are some benefits to being an S Corp over a C Corp, particularly if you want to stay relatively small, not go public, etc. I don't talk a ton about corporations usually when I do these, because because most artists are not going to be starting a corporation, right? But I just wanted you to broadly have the broad strokes. Okay, a nonprofit is also a corporation, but it's a corporation. Oh, and one of the things that's important about corporations is that there's a legal responsibility of the corporation, that their purpose is to make as much, to create as much profit for the shareholders as possible. And that shareholders bit is important, that the profit has to go to the shareholders, not the CEO, not the staff, not the employees, right? So when you look at these big corporations, you're like, why are they running that way? It's because they're legally required to operate for the benefit of the owners, the shareholders, right? capitalism. Okay, nonprofit is a corporation formed for social good rather than profit generation. It's not owned. So if somebody tells you they own a nonprofit, they are not fully understanding what a nonprofit is. Yeah, MJ, that kind of rocked my world and like made me understand like big publicly owned companies and their business decisions so much more. So the organization isn't owned, it's governed by a volunteer board of directors. This does not mean that the entity doesn't have revenue and that it does not or should not pay its employees a fair wage. I'm sure y'all are on board with the fact that nonprofits, particularly nonprofit arts organizations, should be paying all of its employees, particularly its artists, a fair wage. And they have to have revenue in order to operate, right? These are all, I could talk about that, the equity issues involved in those two sentences for like 12 hours. So registering and creating an official nonprofit, it's a pretty extensive legal and tax process that requires an application to the IRS. The entity is tax exempt, so it does not pay taxes. And it has to be for a specific social good. Do y'all have questions about nonprofits? Or are you like, I'm not gonna start one, so, and when I do, I'll talk to you? Yeah, cool. Anyway, they're governed by a volunteer board of directors. Okay, benefit corp. Yeah, I'm gonna finish in an hour. Okay, I made this too short, y'all. Benefit corporation. So this is also a state by state thing. We have a benefit corporation in Rhode Island. This is a for-profit corporation with what we call a double bottom line. So it's a corporate entity that organizes with a specific social good purpose alongside a profit. So this essentially, if you're going to make a corporation, this protects you from only having to care about financial profit for the shareholders, right? It says that this social good is as important as making money. So that's a great option for arts businesses as they grow, if they're big enough to become corporations, because it enables the owners to say, no, we have this other purpose other than just making money. That being said, similar to the L3C, it is a lot of a marketing tool. There's, I think, 19, some amount of states that's in the teens now have benefit corporation as a legal entity that you can elect. So again, it's a state level legal entity. There's also something called the B Corp, which is the same thing, but it's a certification process that basically was created at the beginning of this move to start this new form of business entity as a national certification that you say these things, but it's not a technical legal entity within a state. So it's a totally separate, just like thing that you apply for and is a certification like certified organic, right? Except with a little more, well, I won't start about certified organic stuff. Anyway, so there's two separate things when you talk about benefit corporations. There's both this legal entity, which we have in Rhode Island, and the certification that's a national nonprofit. And it's 4:43, and that's all my slides on legal entities. So I'm gonna stop the share and let's talk about it. What questions do you all have? How can I help you? Yeah, Rachel.
Okay, so I have a question. So my whole artistic career, I have been a sole proprietor because I haven't really sold myself very much, right? So I go to a gallery, the gallery sells. So they're the ones that are doing that. So that's how I've handled all of it. But now with the pandemic and with more people going to websites instead of that, I've actually started selling more off my own website and then myself through Instagram. So does it make sense for somebody in that position to then be considering going to an LLC? And what does that mean to me as like paperwork?
So paperwork wise, you'll file with the Secretary of State to become an LLC, and there's a $150 filing fee. It just gives you some additional liability protection and separation. It also formalizes your business a little bit more. Tax-wise, there's no difference from being a sole proprietorship, right? LLC is not a tax structure. So your taxes will be exactly the same. The way you report the income will be the same, all of that. It just gives you a little bit, it gives your personal assets a little bit of distance from business liabilities.
Thanks.
Are there more fees for LLCs? I recall the last time I researched it, in addition to the filing fee, I think there was a $400, it was either yearly or some other fee.
The $400 one that you're thinking of, I think, is just for corporations. You don't have to file the complete paperwork for an LLC every year, but you have to file some sort of, you have to say you're still in business. You have to say, yes, I'm still doing this. Here's some money. I think it's either every year or every 2 years as an LLC, and that's at the state level, Secretary of State. We're very lucky in Rhode Island that like the Secretary of State's website is pretty easy to use. And their staff, particularly their staff that works in this kind of area, is pretty responsive. I think that is partially helped by the fact that one of the Secretary of State's graphic designers is an artist who I know and love. Right, but like she understands what y'all are doing. But anyway, this is why you hire artists for every entity of government, right? Because they're really good at translating information in a visual way. But yes, you have to, so you file articles of incorporation to start the LLC, and it's a $150 filing fee. And then you'll check in, you'll just like recertify every year that you still exist. You'll also have to reserve your business name with the Secretary of State, which you should be doing anyway. If you have a business name that's separate from your name as a human. But we'll talk significantly more about names and how to protect them and what filing you need to do next week. Other questions?
Patrick asked.
Yes.
In the chat.
Yeah, so yeah, you don't have to file the full LLC application every year, but you have to certify every year that you're still in business. And I think there's a smaller fee every year. I can actually probably look that up right now.
Is there another class where we're getting more into the outside investments and loans ideas? Because that was sort of like one of the things highlighted about the difference between sole proprietorship versus LLC potentially.
There isn't. I can talk a little bit about that now. Part of it is like, because I don't, you know what I need to do is I need to ask somebody from SBA to come talk about that. So I might see if I can do that. Because I don't really understand small business loans, except they're very not arts friendly, right? They're like very not arts friendly, which is something that we are in. So we've been having some conversations with LISC about, because they do a lot of backing of what so-called risky lending. And on a national level, they do a decent amount of arts support. So, but the SBA does have loans. It's always, you're always going to look better on paper applying for a loan if you have more business formalization rather than less, right? So an LLC protects you, protects your assets, and also makes you look more serious. There aren't really any, Jim, there aren't really any disadvantages to registering a business or a sole proprietorship with the state of Rhode Island. The benefits are that you're complying with some legal stuff, you're easy to find, your name, there's only, okay, let me do it one at a time. Oh, annual tax. Minimum annual tax, that's a whole thing. So really it's about the advantages of registering as a business with the state of Rhode Island are really focused on reserving your name and being set up as a recognized business when you're applying for funding. Particularly if you're going to get, and we will be talking about this later in the course, certified as a women or minority owned business, which gives you some advantages in government contracting. But the other thing it gives you advantages in nowadays is things like the Restore RI grants have funding set aside specifically. You know, a lot of those small business financial relief at the state level programs have funds specifically set aside for women and minority owned businesses, which is a certification at a state level. Are there more than two types of nonprofits? There's only one, there's a lot of types of nonprofits, right? The one we think about and the one that I was talking about, and I should have been more specific, is a 501c3, which is the social good piece. There's also 501c4s, which are not tax exempt, and those are things like, what's a really good example? Planned Parenthood Action Fund. So not Planned Parenthood, the health clinics, but Planned Parenthood, the lobbying firm, which is a separate entity. So they do a lot of political issue and issue advocacy, right? Which nonprofits are sort of prevented from doing, right? Nonprofits have to be apolitical and they cannot spend a substantive amount of their expenses on lobbying. But that gets into real dicey territory. So there's a bunch of different, there's also like churches and other religious institutions or nonprofits. There's a bunch of different forms of 501c. 3, 4, 6 are the common ones. 501c3 is the one that you think of all the time. There's just one type. Questions? Are we going to be in under an hour? I feel like a little bit embarrassed, but this is also the first time I've run this class, so I will know for next time that I need to partner this with another topic.
So can I ask a question about what Serena posted about the legal business entities having to pay a minimum of $400 to the state? Is that true? Because that's a lot of state tax for an artist to pay.
I need to do more research into that. My guess is that depending on how successful your business is, you might be paying $400 in tax and you don't know it, right?
Yeah, I pay quarterly, so.
Yeah.
You file the annual report and minimum tax yearly $400. You know, if you make a lot of profits, then the tax goes up. But it's the tax on profits, and it just doesn't get below $400. So yeah, you are liable for that every year.
So even if you post a loss or whatever one year, you still have to pay that $400 if you are an LLC.
If you go to the link that I linked, it has a nice helpful chart, and it has a little asterisk, and it says the tax is owed whether or not business is conducted or a profit is made.
Yeah, you pay that pretty much no matter what. If you have business losses, you could report those losses on your federal income tax because the LLC passes through to your personal taxes.
Okay. Got it.
Which nonprofit is allowed to have a profit arm or a source of income? Okay, so that's two different questions. So in nonprofit world, a lot of times we'll call it revenue. So think about if you go to Trinity Rep and you buy a ticket, right? That's a source of revenue for them. If you donate money, that's a source of revenue to them, right? They still have expenses. They still have to pay, you know, utilities, pay all of their employees. They have to pay all of these things. So you can still have revenue, and you can still have revenue that exceeds your expenses, right? That's actually good to have a rainy day fund in case like something crazy like a pandemic hits and all of your revenue goes away all of a sudden. So you still have income as a nonprofit. It's just called revenue, and it doesn't pass through to a business to be taken out in the same way, right? If there's excess revenue, if there's more revenue than expenses, it stays within the nonprofit either as a rainy day fund or you spend more money on something. Which nonprofit is allowed to have a profit arm? So nonprofits can own LLCs. We see, or profit arms, right? We see this a lot. I'm going to give you an example, most thrift stores that are attached to a nonprofit, right? Where the profits, the thrift store money goes to the nonprofit, right? So sometimes it's a nonprofit that owns an LLC or owns a for-profit business that's underneath a nonprofit. So they'll still have to, the business, even though it's sort of within the nonprofit, still has to feed up. Sorry, I'm also getting like a bunch of Teams messages from my boss, so I don't understand why he's like sending 20 things at 5 p.m. This is going to be recorded. He's totally going to watch it. It's fine. He'll laugh at me. Another entity that where a nonprofit owns an LLC is Burning Man. Burning Man is actually a nonprofit. Yeah, they're headquartered in San Francisco, but a separate LLC that's owned by the nonprofit operates the actual festival, but they operate kind of one and the same. And in their case, it like grew out of like a really small collective, essentially one guy, and but so nonprofits can own for-profits as a source of revenue. Yes. Okay. Did that answer your question, Dugan? Okay. Great. Okay. Can you collect sales tax as a sole proprietor? Or do you have to be an LLC? Yes, you can collect sales tax as a sole proprietor, and you better be. Yeah. If you're selling stuff in the state of Rhode Island, you should be collecting sales tax. That being said, in Rhode Island, we have a sales tax exemption for artwork, for like unique works of art. You do have to file a form and get an exemption. Like you have to get an official okay from the Department of Taxation, and then first it goes to taxation, then it comes to RISCA, and we give our yes, this is a person making unique in artwork. And then you'll have to do some reporting at the end of the year, but absolutely, if you're selling stuff, you should be collecting sales tax regardless of your entity, unless you're a nonprofit, which is a whole different animal. But file for that sales tax exemption. And my wonderful boss, Randy Rosenbaum, who oversees that program, will come to one of these classes on the day we're talking about taxes and talk about how to file that, because it's a little bit annoying and I don't really understand it, because it goes through the Department of Taxation, which is just like 4 floors of bureaucracy. Jen.
So I didn't know that, right? So I sell at a store in Warren, and we don't have to pay sales tax on our artwork, but I've sold things from my website and another website, you know, when I did my taxes last year, they never said anything about this. So what does that mean for me?
You're probably okay. Let me do some more research. The state sales tax, so when you do your taxes at the end of the year, that's income tax, which is totally different than state sales tax. Income tax is federal, and then there's also some state, and but sales tax is city and state based, so it's a little more complicated. We'll talk about it more when we get to taxes, but you might have to go back and file some state sales tax reports because it's totally separate from your income tax reporting. And there's a bunch of weird stuff about online sales too that I don't fully understand. Okay. I don't think you have to be registered officially with the city or the state as a business to be collecting sales tax, because as a sole proprietor, you're a business and you should be collecting sales tax when you sell stuff. Dugan, it depends on the number of editions. So we talk about, I think it's limited editions under 200. But if you're mass producing something like a t-shirt and you're producing a lot of them and they're not numbered, that is not considered original art. If you're a printmaker and you're making a print run of 50 and they're all numbered, that is considered original work. There's some flexibility in there, but really it's like making sure that things like, you know, a best-selling novel that's written by a Rhode Island author still has to pay sales tax, right? Because that can spiral. Like, what is considered original art? Is it the Projo? You know? We got sued last year by the ACLU over this. It's been settled, it's fine. No, because they will have, okay, so the question is, you don't need to charge taxes to nonprofits that purchase your work. They'll have a tax exemption form that also exempts them from sales tax. So if AS220, the nonprofit, is buying your work, then you don't need to charge them sales tax, but you do need their proof of nonprofit, their IRS determination letter. I feel like I need to expand tax day a lot into income taxes and sales taxes now, which is helpful because I still can probably. More questions, more thoughts, more confusions? When I update the website tomorrow, the Business Bootcamp page on RISCA's website, I'm gonna put a bunch of links to help you with entity selection and also the varying things that you need to do based on each entity, particularly about, you know, how you file in Rhode Island. So I'll do a lot of those instructive things within, I'll do a big list, a big resource page, because particularly like the Secretary of State's website has a really nice business entity overview graphic that I use all the time, that I can probably drop in the chat right now. Nope, it's not in my recent downloads. Sales tax would be selling paintings. But you don't charge sales tax for freelance services, is that correct? Right, so not for services, but for stuff. But like if it's a commission, it's still a stuff, right? If it's a painting on commission, you're still selling them the painting, even if they're telling you what to paint.
How do you figure out if it's like a service versus you're selling them a painting, since it's both? If someone like commissions a painting to their specifications from you?
Are you selling them a thing? Do they get a thing at the end of it?
Yes.
Then
Okay.
it's, yeah.
And you
Services would be like business coaching, where there's not a thing.
Oh.
There's not a product at the end. So like most performing artists don't do sales tax, right? Because there's not a thing. Or like teaching artists, because I know there's at least one teaching artist in the room, right? So like that isn't a thing, it's a service. So that would just be income as opposed to a painting. Other questions? Has this been helpful at all, y'all? Okay, good.
Yeah, I learned that I should be charging sales tax, and I never knew this. I guess that's important.
Yeah, I also want to keep y'all legal.
Is it, you know, so I only started my website last year, so when I did my taxes, is it because they're like, you haven't, I made more of a loss, like on, you know, buying materials and setting up my studio than actually selling things? Is that why they didn't really care when I did my taxes, that I?
No, because when you're doing your taxes, you're filing, it's your income taxes. The sales tax goes to a different thing and is a completely different report, right? And it's also, sales tax is something you should be passing along to the consumer. It's not something you should be absorbing unless you choose to, because it's easier for you, right? But it's totally separate from income taxes.
So
which is why they don't ask you about it on your yearly income tax return.
So if I start an LLC and I'm making and selling my own jewelry, but then I'm also providing a service, like I'm working freelance for someone else's jewelry business, that just goes as regular income? Yeah. I don't have to do anything special for that.
No, are you W-2'd or 1099'd?
A 1099.
Yep, so then it would just go on your Schedule C as still your art practice income.
Okay.
I'm gonna go back to the sales tax. So what about sales you make in other countries is a different thing, but other states? So does Rhode Island want you to file the sales tax for other states?
Other states want you to file the sales tax for other states.
So wait, you mean to tell me that I have to file state income tax forms in every state that I sell a painting?
Not income tax.
Sales tax.
Sales tax, yes.
Oh my God.
We'll talk about this more in detail when we get to the taxes day. So for sales tax, it's where you sell the thing. For income tax, it's where you do the work. If that makes sense. So if you're creating the work in Rhode Island, then the income tax is just in Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
But like, you know, we've seen this with Amazon. One of the reasons a lot of states and cities kind of reacted really negatively when Amazon got real big is because their tax codes, particularly sales tax codes, had not caught up with e-commerce yet. E-commerce blew up before the tax codes caught up. So you weren't paying any state sales tax when you bought something from Amazon. Meanwhile, state sales taxes were kind of decimated because everybody was buying stuff on Amazon, and it's a major, you know, income stream, revenue stream for states as the sales, and cities It's really important for cities. So now it has caught up, but it's sales taxes on a state and city basis, so it's different everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I am now like totally gonna rework my taxes day to talk a lot about sales tax. which I don't super understand, so I might need to get an accountant, but luckily I know some.
Yeah, that seems like a lot of paperwork.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Think about like a lot of folks who tour have to file tax returns in every single state that they tour to because they're making the income in every state. That's a whole thing. Yeah, and like particularly relevant to like performing artists who work in Rhode Island, because nobody who works in Rhode Island only works in Rhode Island, right? Like I live a mile from the border. So yeah, everything is hard and complicated, and there's a ton of paperwork. And that is why some very smart people have said that as a practicing artist, you spend about 50% of your time making art and about 50% of the time running the business, which is like sort of a gut punch, you know, but it is what it is, right? You're running a pretty complicated small business. What software can help with taxing structure or online structure? Dugan, can you clarify what you mean by that? Do you mean like bookkeeping? Do you mean entity selection? So bookkeeping, there's like a couple of different ways to do it, and it depends on how complicated your stuff is. When I was a freelancer, I did my bookkeeping at the end of, I was a like, do what I say, not what I do example, but it worked for me. And that's the most important part, is I literally had a box divided by month, and I would label the receipt of what it was for and toss it in the box and then do it at the end of the year, right? I did not have a bookkeeping system other than that. And then once I was doing it at the end of the year, I just used an Excel spreadsheet. If your stuff is a little bit more complicated than that, particularly if you're selling things, you might want something like QuickBooks, which can also auto-generate invoices that you can send to the folks you're selling. But there's a bunch of different bookkeeping programs. I like QuickBooks because I like Intuit, which is the maker of QuickBooks and also makes TurboTax. They're one big company. I also like Intuit because, and this is like a very Rhode Island, but not Rhode Island thing. I like Intuit a lot because the help center is in my hometown in Tucson. So a lot of times when you call Intuit for help, you're calling people that I might, you know, I know some of them still, just because it was a major employer in my hometown. Yeah, so there's a ton of different bookkeeping systems. We'll talk about them when we get to the finances day, when we're going to talk specifically about records and bookkeeping and how to do that and what things you need to keep track of and what all the systems are. Same for taxes. Like when I was an artist, freelance artist, and my taxes were really complicated, I had the immense luck of being the kid of two CPAs. So my parents did my taxes, which is partly why I speak this language a little bit. It's because I grew up around with two CPAs, and I like worked in their tax firm as both a teenager and then again as an adult after in the wake of the 2008 recession, when there was when going was rough for artists. So yeah, there's a lot of different systems for all of the things. The biggest thing that I will always recommend is like the thing that works for you is the thing that works, and it's going to be different for every person, and the system is going to be different. If you set up a super complicated and detailed bookkeeping system and then never look at it again, that doesn't help, right? But if you have a box where everything is labeled and you can pull it together at the end of the year, and you consistently do that and it works, then that does work, right? That's better than just not touching it at all. Yeah, I like to tell people that I kept all my stuff in a box because I feel like it's very intimidating, and a lot of folks feel like they should have some really complicated, detailed online system, and really the important thing is that you keep track somehow and it works for you and you'll keep up with it. So yeah, a box plus a spreadsheet plus a file in my email where I put the online receipts, right? But we'll talk about that more in detail another week. Yes, definitely. It's definitely better to be keeping track as you go than it is just to throw everything in a box and look at it once a year. Particularly if you're a visual artist, I think like a lot, you know, since my background was solely in performing arts, it was very different because I didn't, you know, my income was different than a visual artist. More questions, thoughts, feelings, needs?
I got a phone call while you all were discussing, but I'm curious about the, or still have a question. I guess you are going to do more research, Molly, but if I'm doing freelance work, for example, freelance illustration work for a company that's located in New York, and I get a
1099.
They have my, yeah, a 1099, or in another case, maybe like, yeah, if I get a 1099, I have historically been filing in those states when it's like over, I forget what X
600.
amount of, yeah, when it's over 600. Is that the right thing to do, or is that excessive because it's not a sales tax thing, but it's a 1099 thing?
Yeah, so I'll separate again. The sales tax is a totally separate state-only report that's completely separate from income tax. Income tax, were you physically in New York, or was the company just based in New York? You were physically in Rhode Island. So this is something you might want to consult with a tax professional about. But I think you don't need to be filing in New York because you did the work in Rhode Island.
Okay.
But you should ask an
Yes.
expert.
All right. I will inquire because I have been doing that. But maybe I don't need to be, which would be awesome because I often send out like for like several states and it's awful.
Yes. Other questions? Do you have other questions about things aside from business entities and taxes?
And do we come to a consensus that we don't know if you have to pay a $400? You do because it comes through your sales tax?
No, it's minimum income tax to be an LLC in the state of Rhode Island. You have to pay at least $400 in tax as an LLC. But it's also possible that you're already paying that if you're making a profit with like things like self-employment tax, etc. Unless you make a loss.
Okay, that hurts my brain. I can't understand it for my personal case, but
yeah. Tax, sales tax, bookkeeping lessons come before marketing. Probably. I can reorder everything. Nobody will freak out, right?
It seems like a lot of us are stressed out about a lot of the topics. I've been stressed out about sales tax for a while, and it scares me every single time I try to research it. So I don't know. I feel like there's at least three or four of us here who are like, we should learn more about this. This is scary.
Okay. Would, as the folks who have been here for 2 weeks now, would y'all like to switch my Finance 101 and 201 with Marketing 101 and 201? So let me screen share. So basically switching Finance 101 and 201 to October 27th and November 3rd, and then having marketing be November 10th and 17th. Would that be helpful to y'all? Would you like that? Yes, okay, great. I will do so. I will update the website and we'll talk, I will make sure that we talk extensively about sales tax. So I have some work to do between now and then, or some recruiting of a local tax accountant, which should be, I should be able to do that. Yeah, cool. This is what I like about like small groups and being a person that's known for like flexibility and informality, is I'm like, oh, this isn't working, let's switch it all up. That's my preferred method of teaching, right? Because it's not for me, it's for y'all. Okay, any last questions? Okay, well, we all just regained 40 minutes of our lives. This recording will be up tomorrow, along with a bunch of resources on business entities and some stuff about filing with Secretary of State, which we'll talk more about next week. And then I'll also update the schedule on the website to reflect the flip-flopping of finance and marketing.
Thank you.
Y'all are so awesome. Thank you so much for coming to these, and I hope that they are helpful. And again, feel free to email me any feedback, please.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
you.
Thanks.